Alright, so the first thing that we're going to talk about in this section is how to define objects with specific property types in TypeScript. But before we jump into this, what we're going to do first is create a new TypeScript project to put all of this code inside of. Now, the reason that we're creating a new TypeScript project here is first of all so that we don't have to keep writing our code inside this My First TS project folder. And I also want to show you another way to set up a TypeScript project that many people prefer using the TypeScript CLI. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to create a new directory, and we'll create it right next to our My First TS project directory that we created before. And what we'll do here is we'll just say make directory, and we'll create one called something like custom types, okay? Because that's really what we're going to be talking about here. So let's create that directory, and then we're going to change directories into there. Well, actually, I guess we should probably open up this directory in our IDE first. So I'm just going to type code and open up our custom types directory. You can always just do file open if this command doesn't work for you. So anyway, once you have this new custom types directory open, and it is just an empty directory, keep in mind, we're going to set it up using the TypeScript CLI, and it's actually a very easy thing to do. So first of all, though, make sure you have the tsc command. You should be able to run tsc-version and see the version number of the tsc command that you're using. And once you have that, you can just run tsc-init, and that will just automatically create this new tsconfig.json file for you. And this contains a lot of just basic options that you can comment out or uncomment according to the settings that you want, right? So this is a really easy way just to get all of those settings in one file for you so that you can really just toggle them on and off without having to look up all the different setting names. All right, now if you look for the include property in this file, you're actually not going to find it, and that's because it just doesn't add that by default. So if we want to specify a specific directory that we want all of our TypeScript files to be inside of, all we need to do is outside the compiler options object, we're going to add a property called include, and we'll just do the same value that we did in our previous project, and that's going to be /source/***.ts, right? This will get all of the TypeScript files, no matter how deeply nested, inside the source folder that we'll create over here in the file tree. So let's just create a new folder called source. And we'll also add the out directory option here, and that, I'm gonna just check here and see if that's here. Yep, that actually is included in the compiler options object, so you can just comment that out. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna change the path here to /build, or ./build that is, and that will create a build folder for us whenever we want to build our TypeScript. And that will create a new build folder for us containing our JavaScript files whenever we build our TypeScript. So now that we've made those changes, let's just create a new file inside our source directory, which we'll call something like app.ts. And oops, I added an extra backslash there. Let's try removing that like so. And there we go, we have our TypeScript file. So now that we've gone through all of that, hopefully that shows you the basics of just using that tsc init command to create a new TypeScript project. And you might be surprised how little that command actually does for us, right? It just creates this tsconfig.json file, but nevertheless, that's a really useful command to know just because it puts all of those properties in that file for you already, so you don't have to type them out yourself. So anyway, let's talk now about how to define objects with specific property types in TypeScript. Now, we saw previously that whenever we wanted to define an object, TypeScript actually provides a specific object type that we can use. So, if we wanted to say something like let person object equals, then we could just create an object and we can add pretty much whatever properties we want, right? So we could say name Sean, we could say hair color brown, and so on and so forth. All right, so that's the object type as we saw, but the problem here is that this doesn't really tell us anything about the object that we're defining, right? And when we're working with objects, most of the time we don't really care so much that it's an object. we usually care more about the exact properties that that object contains, right? So does this object have a name property, for example? This in JavaScript, as you're probably familiar with by now if you've worked with JavaScript, can be the cause of some pretty frequent errors when you try and access a property on an object that doesn't exist. All right, so the nice thing here is that TypeScript actually provides us with syntax for defining object types that have specific properties that are strings, numbers, etc. And in order to see what that looks like, let's just assume that we want to define a person object that has just name and hair color properties, right? We can add more things here if we want to later on, but maybe we'll also add age, and I'll just make my age 123 here. So let's say that we want to write a program where this person object, right, this basic template with name, hair color, and age is used across many different objects, and we want to be able to know that any one of those objects is going to contain a specific set of properties. Well, the easiest way to do that would be, instead of defining a variable type as object, we can actually put a different kind of syntax after the colon here, right after the variable name, and that looks like this. So in our case here, if we wanted to define an object with a name property that's a string, a hair color property that's a string, and an age property that's a string, what that would look like is we would say name, string, hair color, string, and age, number, okay? And as you can see, if we hover over person now, it will actually tell us the exact property types that this object is going to have, right? And what this means is that later on, if we try and say something like person.hair color and we mistype the property name, right, and try and set it to something like blonde, if I were to dye my hair, let's say, well, then that's going to give us a warning here telling us that the property hair color does not exist on this person type, and it's going to ask us in some cases if we mean some other property type. Right, so basically that's going to prevent us from accidentally adding other properties to these objects, and it's going to make sure that at any point in time we know what properties an object is going to have and what types those properties are. All right, now in this example that we just saw here, it's nice now that we can see all of the properties that this person is going to have. But going back to what I said earlier, if we wanted to write a TypeScript program where we had multiple different instances, so to speak, of this type of object, right, with name, hair color, and age, then what we would have to do in that case is every time we declare a variable, right, we say person2, we'd have to add that exact same rather lengthy type declaration here, right? So we'd have to type name string, hair color string, and age number over again. And then we'd have to add those properties and their values in the declaration. So obviously this would be a little bit unpleasant and unnecessarily verbose. So what TypeScript allows us to do is it allows us to define custom named types by using the type keyword. So what that's going to look like is we can say type person, and then we can say equals, and we can put this type declaration after that equals sign, right? So if we paste that here, what that's going to do is it's going to create a custom type that we can now use after the variable name and the colon instead of having to type out that whole thing, right? So it just gives us a name to refer to a specific combination of properties and types in an object. So now we can say person after the colon, and if we hover over person here, we see that it now displays the type as person, which by looking at this declaration up here, we can tell what properties that's actually going to have, and the behavior that we looked at a little bit earlier where we're no longer allowed to try and access properties that don't exist is true as well. All right, so this is a really helpful way if we want to use the same combination of properties in multiple objects. It's a really helpful way to be able to do that in a much less verbose way, right? So now we could just say let person2 person, and we could just use this person type wherever we want to use it. Now note also that when we declare these variables, TypeScript is going to enforce all of the properties that we defined, right? So if we just try and say let person2 person and put an empty object after that, well, it's going to warn us and say that this object is missing the properties name, hair color, and age, right? So we would have to then go in and add that. All right, now this actually brings me to another point, and that is there are going to be situations where we want objects to have the option of having a certain property, but that they also might not have that property in some cases, right? So, in the case of a person, they might not have filled out their age on the questionnaire, right, as people tend to do. Or, with hair color, if someone were to be bald, you might want to leave that blank. And in that case, TypeScript allows us to define optional properties just by putting a question mark after the property name, right? So if we wanted to make age and hair color optional, all we would have to do is put a question mark after those property names, and now all that TypeScript's going to force us to do is define the name property. So if we add a name to this person, and we say something like Bob, all right? Well, TypeScript's perfectly happy with that because hair color and age are both optional. Now, if you hover over either of these properties, you're also going to see that the type for this thing isn't just string or number, but it's actually number or undefined, right? It's got this little pipe symbol, which basically means that the type can be either the thing before it or the thing after it. And this is actually something that's referred to as a union type in TypeScript. Now, the somewhat tricky thing with these optional properties and union types is if we now go to access, let's say, hair color on a person, right? If we were to say something like, let Sean's hair color equals person.hair color. Well, since that property is optional, if we want to define this Sean's hair color as a string, TypeScript's not going to let us do that. And the reason for that is because this hair color isn't guaranteed to be a string any longer. In other words, it might be undefined as well. So the type that we would have to add for this hair color would be string or undefined. All right, and in this way, optional properties can sometimes tend to spread throughout your code base because you start having to add optional types onto the variables that you take off of these objects. And then when you use these variables in, certain operations, that can spread through there as well. So one way that you can prevent that, right, if you wanted to make sure, for example, that Sean's hair color was a string, right, this variable here, you can always just add a backup type by using a regular old JavaScript or TypeScript double or symbol, rephrase, by using a regular old JavaScript or TypeScript or symbol. And we could just provide a backup value here saying bald, right? Right, so that would be the backup value in this case. And if we hover over Sean's hair color now, we see that TypeScript's fine with us calling this a string because even though person.haircolor could return undefined, we have a backup value in that case. So either way, this variable is going to be a string. All right, so anyway, that's how to define custom object types in TypeScript. And as a matter of fact, you can also use this type declaration to create things like aliases for other types, right? Whether that's just a basic type in TypeScript or some sort of union type. And to show you what I mean here, let's say that we want to define a specific hair color type in TypeScript, right? That can either be a string or undefined. Well, in that case, what we could do is we could just say type hair color equals, and then we could say string or undefined. All right, so now we could use this custom type that we defined down here, and we could say hair color, and now we wouldn't have to add that backup value if we didn't want to, because hair color is now representative of either a string or undefined. And you can see that if you hover over the actual type that we put after the variable as well, right? That tells us what that custom type is. All right, so anyway, that's how to define simple custom object types in TypeScript. The next thing that we're going to take a look at is how to define slightly more complex types in TypeScript using classes.